Hi, I'm Mark the Crown and Caliber, and welcome to Hidden Gems. When it comes to the history of dive watches, Jaeger-LeCoultre is not a name that's usually mentioned. What JLC does is dress watches, the Master line, the Reverso, and they are fantastic at it. But modern JLC has a sports watch that's worth looking at. It's the JLC Polaris. So let's get into it. So let's start with the origin of the Polaris. JLC was a little late to the game when it came to making a dive watch. 1953, you have the Rolex Submariner coming out right after the Blancpain 50 Fathoms. Those are the origin of the modern dive watch with a rotating bezel that helps you time a dive. It took a while for some people to catch on. 57 is when Omega got on the game and came out with the Seamaster 300. But by the end of the 50s, everybody had a dive watch. A few years later, 1963, JLC finally came out with their first prototype of the Memovox Polaris. The Jaeger-LeCoultre Memovox is a classic piece in their lineup. You use a second crown to set an alarm on the watch. It's a fantastic piece of their history, and it's still made today. And that's what they used to create the dive watch. The Memovox Polaris is what it was originally called. And in '63, they developed the prototype. And in 1965, finally came out with it. So 12 years after dive watches became the popular thing, JLC finally came out with their own. But they did what JLC does. They created their own. They created a internal bezel compressor case. So what that means, as it goes deeper, it actually gets more watertight. So the 200 meters that they could test for back then is what it was rated for, but probably could have gone much further. And the other thing they do is the rotating bezel on the inside of the case. If you have a wetsuit on or gloves, it's not as easy to use as an outside bezel, but it's classier looking. It looks like a JLC Memovox from a distance. And what they did in the advertising was call it a watch for the man of action. What were you doing that day? Were you diving? Were you going to a fancy party or a fundraiser? This was the watch that could do it all because it's a JLC Memovox that can dive. And it also has another little thing to it, the original one. Because it was a Memovox, you can actually set an alarm that worked underwater. So it wasn't just the visual of when your dive was over, it was also the sound of the alarm. So you really had two ways to know when it was time to surface. It wasn't until 2018 that JLC finally came out with their steel sports watch in the new Polaris. So being late to the party, it's again overlooked. They haven't had it out for multiple decades, but it is a beautiful watch. The Polaris is now a modern sports watch versus a dive watch. It still has the internal diving bezel, but it's not 200 meter or 300 meter like we see usually now. It's 100 meter. So feel free to swim with it, wash dishes with it, don't dive with it. First impressions for this one on me, I look at the numerals and they look a lot like the Patex's Pilot watch. They stand out, there's a dimensionality to them, they're clear, they're crisp. They just don't look like the next guy's watch in person. They are so well executed. And the dial itself has 3 different finishes. There's a sunburst in the middle, there's a textured dial, and the very edge of the diving bezel is a flat matte blue. And those different layers and the different textures look a lot like the Alanganzona Odysseus. That's such a beautiful dial. And this is a combination of those 2 dials. It really punches so far above its weight, and it's a JLC to begin with, a brand that really does stand out when you get into the details of each of their watches. The steel bracelet, beautiful. It's a 3-link bracelet. It's got polished center link. It's an easy bracelet to wear. This watch is just a perfectly executed sports watch, and it fits in as a dress watch too. It's just over 11 millimeters, which makes it smaller and thinner than the Submariner by 2 millimeters, the Seamaster 300 by 2.5 millimeters. It sits so well, but feels heft to it. It's unfortunate that JLC was late to the party because they really did take their time and make a great watch. But it gets ignored with all the other watches out there that are in the same category. The Blue Dial Steel Sports Watch. But this one really deserves your attention. And that's why for me, the Jaeger-LeCoultre Polaris is a hidden gem. I hope you enjoyed me talking about the JLC Polaris. If there's another Steel Sports watch that flies under the radar, let us know in the comments. Thank you for joining me on Hidden Gems.